intersectionality is an approach that draws on Black feminist activism and theorizing from the 1970s and 1980s, but also now has very much global resonance and has been used to look at the experiences of migrant women and racialized migrant women very often. And I think what's important to think about here is that this is an approach that looks at the experiences of inequalities, power relations, but also the resistance to these, and argues that we cannot understand these inequalities and power relations of race, gender, class, sexuality, ability, disability as disconnected from each other, but that they're experienced as very much intermeshing, but also that the structures of oppression and structures of inequality are also interconnected and interlinked.
It's not about power only, it is also about identity, and I talk to my students a lot about that. People don't have one identity. It depends very much on who's asking and in which context this question is asked, how you self-identify, and what this does to the chances you have within a society. And so I talk to my students about, how would you self-identify most prominently, and when and why does that change? And how is this important to what you do and the chances you have and the restrictions you meet within societies? And all these questions, of course, also relate to migrants. It's a general question, but it's also a question which affects everybody, and migrants included.
For example, we need to even understand which women we are talking about. What are the different aspects of their identities or their life experiences that make them different from other women? Which socioeconomic class do these women come from? Which racial group do these women identify with? Which religious tradition do these women associate with? And based on all those factors, we would be dealing with different groups of women. And even within each group, of course, there'd be, you wouldn't see homogeneity necessarily. And so you have to treat each group in a different way and be open to the intersectionality of different elements.
I think this is particularly important for scholars of gendered migration, because oftentimes, and for a long time also, migrant women themselves have not been seen as producing knowledge or valid knowledge about their own situations. They haven't been seen as producing perhaps insights into power relations, but also activism around their own situations. But they've often been cast both by policymakers, by politics, and also sometimes academia as rather passive recipients of the situations in which they are. So an intersectional approach can help us to understand better the specific forms of power relations, oppressions that migrant women are facing, that racialized migrant women may be facing, and also to challenge them at the same time.
So that's what intersectionality does, and queer theory is a subfield of that, in my view, that it looks at sexuality foremost, and it says, okay, like studies in gender and migration, which says, okay, look at gender, and there's religion migration, says, okay, look at religion as a key element of power and identity. Queer theory does more than that, but it also looks at sexuality and migration and how sexuality influences the choices people make, the identities people have, the restrictions they meet, etc., etc.
For example, even queer communities, when they seek asylum in any place, their identities are at risk or at question. They are often denied their identity. Often they have to prove themselves and prove their gayness, so to speak. And so a lot of times, they are denied asylum because they cannot prove that they are gay enough. So that is one of the major problems when it comes to asylum seeking. The politics of it is very intersectional in nature. It's not that all people are treated the same way across the board. You'd experience differential vulnerabilities even in that process based on who you are. And who you are is what needs to be understood.
So in 1981, this was the first time this was recognized, that there is such a thing as sexual persecution, and that you can claim refugee status based on that. So that might be a reason why you move from where you live. You say, okay, but since people beat me up, if I go to the police beats me up, I can't go out, I can't walk hand in hand with my boyfriend, things like that. It's always about man, it's never about women. So this is one element of queer theory, drawing attention to how sexuality can be a reason to move. And this also affects, of course, and that's the second element, other aspects. So one is persecution, but the other element is, of course, people who want to marry but can't marry in their country of origin. So that's nothing to do with persecution per se, it's that just the law doesn't exist, and in other countries it does. So they move to other countries where they can get married, they can get involved in a same-sex marriage, and then they end up living in this country because the law allows them to do that. So this creates a whole new migration channel or a more migration motive. I mean, there was nothing wrong perhaps with the life you had in the country of origin, except for that you wanted to get married, and this wasn't an option.
Traditional media has generally been more of a negative influence when it comes to the image that people have of women who are refugees, women who are seeking asylum, women who are migrants in any context.
An example that I can give is around issues of care and care work. So migrant women are very often concentrated in jobs or employment that is on care and care work. And one of the things that happens is that the devaluation, let's say, of the work, of the particular type of work of caring, cleaning, domestic work, perhaps reproductive work, that is already societally really anchored, is then reinforced both by the gendered, but also migration and racialized status of the people who carry out that work. So the difficulty of achieving decent working conditions, for example, of having long-term, safe employment contracts, of having decent pay, etc., is oftentimes compounded by the fact that this type of work is carried out by racialized migrant women who are not seen as perhaps politically powerful and able to influence even the policies, unfortunately, sometimes of trade unions. So that's one example.
And what intersectionality does is say, okay, if you want to explain control, if you want to explain roots, if you want to explain the discourse about migration, also how people talk about migration, you have to look at this intersectional perspective. You have to look at that, changes in the discourse, changes in policy, changes in governance, changes in roots, and also changes in connections, how people feel connected to countries of origin. You have to do this from this intersectional perspective, because otherwise, if you don't take, for instance, class into account, or don't take sexuality into account, or disability, or any of the other aspects of intersectionality, you can't really explain such a complex phenomena as migration and everything connected to it. This, of course, also complicates the life of policymakers. So if you tell policymakers, please do this, well, it becomes a very difficult task to perform. So you tell policymakers, yeah, make policies for migration, make policies for integration. taking into account all the aspects of intersectionality. Yeah? So it takes into account gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, etc., etc. And so you tell a policymaker who doesn't have much time, who doesn't have much money to spare, deal with this, deal with all these forms of diversity, with all these various diversities. And that's a very difficult task to perform. And that means that they also fail. So they start to prioritize one diversity over the others. They look at ethnicity much more than class, or gender much more than sexuality. And then in the end, the policies fail. And failure of policies is bad for democracy. If the idea exists that policies are failing, democracies get to be criticized. So one element of what intersectional theory does is highlighting precisely this element. Look, if we do tell people, deal with this, deal with all these forms of diversity, all the various diversities, but then don't equip them with how to do that, then they're likely to fail, and that leads to criticism on the workings of democracy. So this is a very important contribution of this intersectional perspective.